We should pursue things with our mind, but we should also pursue it with the part of our mind that listens to the Holy Ghost. And so I start out with an assumption that the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon and anything else excuse me, that we get from the restored gospel is true. Therefore, any evidence I find, I will try and fit into that paradigm. It's also quite possible that the papyri serves as a catalyst, just like the English text of the Joseph Smith translation serves, that as he looks at the papyri, revelation just starts to come to him for what we need as the Book of Abraham. A book that I believe is a real book that was written, but I don't know if it was even on the papyri. The difficulty that we have as Egyptologists is trying to figure out what did ancient Egyptians think these drawings meant when we don't have any ancient Egyptians from that time period that actually tell us what it meant. So you see the problem with this assumption. If we want to compare what Joseph Smith said to what the ancient Egyptians would have said, we can't do it because we're assuming that Egyptologists can tell us what ancient Egyptians said. We don't have any of them around to interview. So we go to Egyptologists, and sometimes we Egyptologists just don't know. I don't know that we should be comparing what Joseph Smith said these things meant to what ancient Egyptians would have thought they meant. It's very possible that we should be asking how would ancient Jews have interpreted these drawings? Maybe Joseph Smith is telling us not how any ancient individual would have interpreted these, but what we needed to get out of them. In the end, we'll have to return to the initial assumption that I spoke about. And that is the assumption that revelation is a valid source of learning.
Joseph Smith was sealed to, I believe, 34 women. Okay? Compton's 33, plus one more that Michael Marquardt found. How many complaints do we have from those wives? 0. Okay, the people who were participating in Joseph Smith's polygamy are not complaining about it, even years later.
There is a persistent criticism I want to address, and that was that Joseph would send men on missions and then quickly marry their wives. And this is simply false. Of the 14 husbands, 10 definitely were not on missions at the time their legal wives were sealed to Joseph. The only documented case is Apostle Orson Hyde, who had been gone almost 2 years before his legal wife was sealed to Joseph. And then we have 2 sealing dates for her, Miranda Hyde, and one of them is after he had returned. And so it's just confusing to know what really happened. And then in the other 3 cases, we don't have marriage dates for the sealing to Joseph, so there's no way to know.
It is true that Joseph Smith practiced plural marriage and that he had wives who were not married to anybody else. And it's true that he practiced polyandry and that he did have wives who were married to someone else.
14 years old, 16 years old.
He had a wife who was 14 years old, but remember, on the frontier in America, women married young, often as young as 12 years of age, because the lifespan of people in those days wasn't what it is today.
Was this a mistake done by Joseph Smith? And if it was, how could he continue to be a prophet? And if it was not a mistake, it must be endorsed by the church, I guess.
Okay, what the church does say on these questions about Joseph Smith in general is this. Either Joseph was a prophet of God, or he wasn't. Correct? And the way in which you decide that, not just intellectually, but spiritually, is the way that Elder Jensen talked about at the beginning. That's the official church.
But why does my spirit talks to me and screams, wrong, 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 even if it's a prophet of God?
Make a decision.
Do I have the devil in me who's talking to me and says I should understand this 14, 16-year-old girls marrying? And I can't, my spirit doesn't, I can't get it to my mind.
Okay,
Is it the devil speaks to me that I should accept that because Joseph Smith is a prophet? So he did that right. It was God told him to do that. Go behind Anna and take these wives.
You know, there are certain things, even from these scriptures, that we cannot explain. So I don't know why Joseph did what Joseph did on these things. We have some more insights. And then, even if you give me an answer, I could question every little answer could go again and again.
But you can
But
you
I
see-
know, one thing that I know is Moses was the prophet. I know that Jesus is the Son of God. And I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. I know that. And so even though I have not all the questions answered, I know that these things are true.
I think that's interesting because I agree with John on the artwork completely. That the art we have in the early book, in the Book of Mormons, we have the Blue Books of Mormon, or Book of Mormons, however you want to say it, right? That it did not show the way that it was written. It was an artist rendition. The difference is I look at that and say, look at that artist rendition that's not accurate based on what's written in all the church documents. John looks at that and says, look how deceptive the church is being. And they publish the insight. But the question is how many pieces of artwork do the general authorities make? 0. They don't paint.
The film Legacy seems to feature the plates right in front of Smith.
Yes, it does. And that was done by, again, a filmmaker who my thought was he got it wrong.
I just wonder how many converts have access to those articles from the 70s before they make their choice to join the church.
Well, there again, it goes back to his other comment about Brigham Young. And yes, they did take the word wives out and put wife in and put it in brackets. And I disagree with doing that. But you have to go back to why is the manual there? Is the manual there to teach history? Is the manual there to talk about polygamy? No, the manual's there to teach about how husbands should treat their wife. As far as the blacks issue, that one's off the table for me completely. Because if you say, well, golly, the church needs to talk about how badly they mistreated blacks, let's talk about what Billy Graham said about blacks. It was bad. Let's talk about what other church leaders said about blacks. Let's talk, it wasn't a mob of angry Mormons in Little Rock keeping those 9 children from going there. That's the question. I mean, that's the issue, is you say, our argument is, as apologists, gee, we're just as good as everybody else. That's not a very good position, but it's no worse than other positions. And to sort of use that as a stick when you don't care about the African Americans, all you care about is using it as a stick to beat up black or beat up the church. To me, I think that's disingenuous.
Some people would say, okay, here's a problem here. If Jesus is there in the 1832 account, and yet he's the Father and the Son are in all the other accounts, Joseph Smith's making this up, or the story's getting better. And again, I think that's a little bit too judgmental. I think we have to look back and say, okay, what is the core message of the 1832 account? And that is the element Joseph Smith is desiring, which was forgiveness of sin. And so in the account, he doesn't mention the Father appearing, not because he wasn't there, but because he emphasizes the fact that the Savior forgave him of his sins. So the fact that there are major differences in these different accounts should not be held against Joseph Smith. It's just what he's bringing out at that time, again, based on audience, based on circumstances, based on what he's trying to tell, based upon his own developmental understanding of the event. And certainly that would change over time, and so each of these accounts will have different elements in them.
The Book of Mormon mentions horses only a handful of times. They are mentioned apparently as being part of livestock in Nemus 1:21 and 3 Nephi 4:4 and in 3 Nephi 6:1, or by King Lamoni, somehow in connection with his chariots, but never said to pull his chariot or even that anyone rode in the chariot. We find that in Alma 18:9-12 and Alma 26. Book of Mormon horses are never mentioned as being ridden, helping with agriculture or in combat, despite these being the common uses of horses during Joseph Smith's day. In some fundamental way, Book of Mormon horses were different than the horses of 19th century America. It's possible that the Reformed Egyptian word for horse referred to a different animal that in some way served as a horse. When the Spaniards brought horses, for instance, many Amerindians called them deer and tapirs. Yes, there are a number of chapters in the Book of Mormon that are the same as the King James Version, but witnesses indicate that Joseph didn't consult Book of Mormon manuscripts while translating the Book of Mormon. So the question arises as to how and why this repetition occurred. LDS scholar Brant Gardner argues that the Lord would have divinely assisted Joseph's memory when it came to translating the biblical passages in the Book of Mormon. which would automatically have called up passages from the family King James Bible.
Why did Joseph speak exact King James English, especially the Isaiah chapters? Isaiah's chapters are really fascinating because one of the things that you can be assured with in the Isaiah chapters is that Joseph was reading a page from the King James Version as he was doing it. Now, the problem with making that statement is he wasn't reading a page from the King James Version as he was doing it. Okay, you've got this wonderful contradiction. There's no evidence at all that he had a page there. There's no evidence that he had it. His head's stuck in a hat where there's no light. But all of the evidence says he was reading it, including the fact that he changed things where there were italics, which means you've got to see the italics to be able to do it. So how do you get that? Again, God has to tweak the right neurons. The page shows up, the words show on the page. All he had to have done is sometime in his life read Isaiah or skimmed over the page. The Lord could recall it for it, show it to him. He sees it there and reads it off. It's the same mechanism.